No, it'll be fine. Once everybody is sort of. Yeah.
Okay, I'll begin. So, it's really great to be here. I just 2.5 years and I don't know what to say, but it's so nice to be here in person, and thank you so much for coming because this is really wonderful. It's been an interesting 2.5 years, as we all know, and now we're here, masked or unmasked or whatever, but at least we're here in person. So the book that we're going to be talking about today, and I hope there'll be a discussion after I'll present, and now that there are live people, because I'm so used to, at the beginning it was a phone line, so I made this little recording and I was talking to myself, and then it was Zoom and I was looking at myself, and for the first time I'm looking at other people, which is just really very nice. So The Lincoln Highway, Amor Towles, who's an author whose books we talked about before. If you remember, this is his third novel. His first novel was a book called The Rules of Civility, which we did on Zoom in COVID era last year. But his first novel, The Gentleman in Moscow, we talked about, remember that? So Gentleman in Moscow was actually his second novel. And we talked about it in 2018, back pre-pandemic in 2018. And then I hadn't read Rules of Civility, but I enjoyed Gentleman in Moscow so much, I went back and I read his first novel, which was Rules of Civility. That was the second one, which was Zoom in last year. And now the third one, which is entitled The Lincoln Highway. How many of you read the book? Just to give me an idea. So most of you read the book. They're going to be like lots of spoiler alerts, but that's the way it goes, because if you want to talk about the book, I'm just going to do it as if everybody has read it, or even if you haven't, that's the way, like you'll know some of the bits at the end. So just to give you a little bit of background about Amor Towles himself, he's a very interesting fellow. And I don't know if you remember, those of you who listened into Rules of Civility, when I talked about it last year, I also spoke a little bit about him. But he lives in New York City. And if you've read his other books, how many read Rules of Civility? A Gentleman in Moscow, I know, was very, so it was very much a New York story. And this book, again, even though it spans it takes place in various places in America, a large part of it is in New York City. Mr. Towles himself was not born in New York. He was born and raised outside of Boston, but he's been living in New York for several decades now. And as I said, he's an interesting fellow. He has his undergraduate degree in English literature from Yale and a master's in English literature from Stanford University. So English was his focus. And as he said in one of his interviews, which I find is a theme in his books, and especially in The Lincoln Highway, is that you can have all your plans, or you think that you know the path that life is going to take you, and then things happen along the way, and things don't go the way you had planned it, not necessarily for any worse, but just differently. So he said that he set out with all his English degrees, he set out to teach English, and he was going to China. And he had a job lined up, but then it was 1989 and it was Tiananmen Square, and he didn't go to China. So he headed off to New York City. And what do you do when you have a degree, an English degree, you know, in itself, unless you're going into academia, it's not so practical. He headed off to New York City, and he was going to try and get a job in publishing. And a friend of his from college said that he was working for a hedge fund, and did Amor want to come along and work with him? And so that's what he ended up doing. He ended up working in investment banking for 20 years, did very well in working for this hedge fund, and then he was able to retire and to devote himself full time to writing, which is what he did. And his So he said, you know, you never know. My plans were that I was going to go and teach English, and that was going to be it. And then he ended up having this very successful career in investment banking, but then went back to be able to continue his dream, and his dream always was to write. And so thanks to the Tiananmen Square, you know, and that he couldn't teach English, he ended up in New York, and where he's lived, by the way, ever since. He said that but while he was working in his financial career, he began working on a novel. This was it seemed like that was his first one, set in the Russian countryside. So maybe, you know, that's where A Gentleman in Moscow came, which didn't turn out to be his first novel. He tossed the manuscript after 7 years of working on it. And finally, in 2006, he decided he was going to start writing again. He made another effort, this time succeeding with what would become his 2011 debut novel, Rules of Civility, set in New York City, not the one in the Russian countryside. So in 2013, he retired so he could devote himself full-time to writing. And his second book was A Gentleman in Moscow. And I don't know if you remember this, but that came out in 2016. According to him, the book was inspired by a business trip that he took to Geneva when he was working in his investment banking career. And he said that he stayed in the same hotel in Geneva, and he noticed the same people staying in the hotel that he had noticed on previous trips. And he began to wonder, this is where an author's imagination comes into play, what it would be like to be trapped for decades inside a hotel. Not that these guests were necessarily trapped, but that gave him the idea. And he wrote his thoughts down on that hotel stationery, notes which he has kept to this very day. And he also said that he keeps notebooks. He has a whole stack of notebooks, like real, just old-fashioned notebooks, where he writes down his ideas. And so Rules of Civility came out first, then Gentleman in Moscow, which was a much longer book, came out second. And now this third one, which is not a short volume either, it's 575 pages. It's quite the epic saga, probably longer than A Gentleman in Moscow. This is the novel that came out last year. And he lives in Manhattan with his wife and 2 children. He calls himself an ardent fan of early 20th century painting, 1950s jazz, 1970s police shows, rock and roll on vinyl. This is funny. I mean, this is his, he probably wrote this bio. Obsolete accessories, manifestos, breakfast pastries, pasta, liquor, snow days, Tuscany, Provence, Disneyland, Hollywood, he goes on and on, card games and cafes, and Bob Dylan, early, middle, and late phases. And rock and roll, anyways, I'll talk about the setting of the book, the time period that this book is set in. I found this interesting review in the Washington Post, and the reviewer there writes the following. He says, this is the reviewer of this book. He says, on a humid afternoon in June 1954, my own parents married in a whitewashed Methodist church in my mother's hometown in rural South Georgia. Rosette windows and palmettos framing the front doors. Vows exchanged, they climbed into a Chevrolet, hood ornament pointed towards a cottage on the Gulf of Mexico. A few black and white snapshots capture their honeymoon. Edges scalloped, remember those black and white scalloped edges of photographs in photo albums with the little corner things that we used to stick them in, 1950s, 1960s. My parents' faces were bright and impossibly young. It is all too easy to peer back at moments from that hopeful post-war era through a veil of nostalgia, even though the economic boom masked darker currents of inequity that would erupt a day later. So that's how he begins his interview, his review of this book. And he says, he goes on to say, and it's that sepia tinted tension between aspiration and reality that fuels Amor Towles' newest novel. And it happens to be set in the same month in June 1954. And I'm just remembering that my own parents got married in June of 1954. This book charts the cross-country adventures of 4 boys. And you know the 4 boys, 3 18-year-olds and 1 8-year-old. And you have Emmett Watson, who's an 18-year-old Nebraskan farm kid just released from a Kansas juvenile detention center after serving 15 months for involuntary manslaughter. His 8-year-old, very precocious brother, Billy, and 2 of Emmett's fellow inmates, whose names are Duchess, if you remember, a fast-talking swindler, and Wooly, who is the scion of an affluent Manhattan family. And I don't know if anybody, well, only one of you has read Rules of Civility, but Wooly was a character. Mr. Towles brings back, he said he likes to occasionally bring back characters from previous novels. So nobody from A Gentleman in Moscow appears in this one. But from Rules of Civility, Wooly's family is mentioned. I don't know if any of you, like, if you read it, if you caught it. So he's back here. And Wooly he comes from this very, very wealthy Manhattan family raised on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And he had also been, we'll find out as the story goes on, he'd been an inmate of this Kansas juvenile detention center as well. So the 3 juvenile detention recent inmates or the boys that had been there, and the 8-year-old brother of Emmett Watson. And it turns out that Emmett's mother, so these are like 4 of the main characters. There'll be other characters in the book. There are a number of characters, and the story shifts between points of view of these various characters. Wow. Pardon? Oh, sorry. Emmett's mother, who it turns out was from the East Coast, she left. She abandoned her family after Billy, who's 8 years old by this time, so she left 8 years earlier. She left, leaving nothing behind her except a trail of a few postcards as to a clue of her whereabouts. Billy's father, who was also an East Coast transplant, and turns out he too came from a very wealthy family that left him artwork and money and the trappings of affluence of the East Coast that Billy's father left. And where he and the mother, they were going homesteading, and the father had dreams of becoming a farmer, went to Nebraska and was not very good at farming, it turns out. And so they were very deep in debt. His father has recently died of cancer. Emmett has been incarcerated in this Kansas juvenile detention center. A neighbor has been taking care of our precocious little 8-year-old Billy. And when Emmett comes back now, he's finished serving his sentence of 15 months. He comes back to the farm. And it turns out that the bank is foreclosing on the farm, but he's reunited with his little brother. And he decides that he's going to indulge 8-year-old Billy's fantasy of trying to find their mother. So, and Billy has this idea that their mother must be out west, must be in San Francisco because of the postcards that she's left. And at this point, Emmett doesn't really have too much, he's just come back. What's he going to do with himself? It turns out that he's been trained as a carpenter. I mean, he's only 18 years old, but he has carpenter skills. And he has this idea, I guess you would call it now house flipping, that he's going to, because that's what he'd been doing, helping to build or renovate houses that needed renovation and then selling them. So he says, but he's going to indulge his little brother's dream of trying to find their mother in San Francisco. But anyways, it sounded like, according to him, this would be a good place to go. This Emmett is a very street smart or detention center smart 18-year-old kid, and they're going to go westward. So Nebraska is kind of in the middle of the country, and there's a map. For those of you, by the way, the Lincoln Highway is a real highway. Where does the book get its title from? I haven't ever realized that. It was built in 1912, and it was the first America's first transcontinental highway. And there's a picture of it at the beginning of the book. You see it. Where does it go? It begins in Times Square in New York City. And if you think of it, there's the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, so there's the Lincoln Highway, and it goes cross country and it ends up in San Francisco. And if you look at the map, Nebraska is pretty much in the middle. It's the Midwest, in the middle of the country. And this highway goes right across. So Emmett's plan is to take Billy and to go from Nebraska to California to San Francisco. He has a car. He has this old powder blue Studebaker. And remember the Studebaker? It actually happened to be my parents' first car that we had a Studebaker. It wasn't kind of so funny. I'm thinking of this now. It was brown. It wasn't like blue, but anyways, I remember Studebaker. So his idea was they're going out from Nebraska to California. There's nothing to keep them in Nebraska. These two brothers, the 18-year-old and the 8-year-old. The father has recently died. The mother had abandoned them, and off they're going to go. Except that it turns out that, unbeknownst to Emmett, two of his friends, former inmates with him in the detention center, have appeared and are there, presented themselves in his house and said, we have other plans. And they explain that they're going to take a little detour. Instead of heading out from Nebraska to San Francisco, they take Emmett's car because they are going to go east to the Adirondacks to try and get the part of Wooly, the kid from the wealthy family, his trust fund, because apparently he has $150,000 in a trust fund that his grandfather has left him, and it's locked in a safe in the family compound in this beautiful lodge in the Adirondack Mountain. Again, if you read Rules of Civility, you'll remember that Adirondack house was described in great detail in that book as well. So it's kind of fun to see the same places appear in this second novel. So instead of going west to San Francisco, Billy and older brother Emmett have to they end up going east to New York City to meet up with the two friends who have borrowed Emmett's car. And so Emmett, he reluctantly agrees to give the pair a lift in his Studebaker, which, as he describes, looked a little like a car that your dentist's wife would drive to bingo. But it was only going to take them as far as the bus station in Omaha. Except the friends. Wooly is this, he's such a sad soul, such a sweet fellow. He comes from this fabulously wealthy family, and he just doesn't fit in. He has, I don't know how you would describe him, but he's just such a misfit in society in general, and particularly in his wealthy Upper East Side family. And how he ended up, if you read the book, how he ended up in this Kansas City detention center after having gotten himself kicked out of 3 very fancy New England boarding schools, is that he happens to take a fire truck, and he thinks that he's going to repark the fire truck in another place, and it leads to something that ends him up back in this detention center. So Emmett says he's taking his friends only as far as the bus station in Omaha, except they have other ideas. Duchess, who's a con artist and son of con artist Supreme, his father, was an actor, but also he was a fraud artist. And Duchess has inherited his talents in that respect. And he takes Wooly, who becomes his sidekick because Duchess feels sorry for Wooly. And these are all voices in the book because we get different points of view. The chapters alternate from, I think it's about 6 characters that we get the voices of. We get Emmett, and we get Duchess, and we get Wooly, and we get Billy, the younger brother, and we get Sally, the neighbor. And the story alternates as well. And there are another few of the minor characters. We also hear their voices. The time frame of the book is 10 days. It's only 10 days. And in an interview, Mr. Towles said that when he started to write the book, he says he gets ideas for the way he's going to set up a story. And in this case, when he was asked, can you tell us a little bit about the structure of the book? How did you set this story up? And he says, as a novelist, as well as a reader, I'm very interested in the role that structure plays in storytelling. both my Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow were conceived with very specific structures in mind. Rules of Civility spanned 1 year from a New Year's Eve, from one New Year's Eve to the next, in the life of a 25-year-old woman. So he writes, if you remember, from the point of view of a 25-year-old young woman. And the next one, A Gentleman in Moscow, spanned 32 years in the life of the main character, with, as Mr. Towles calls it, an accordion-like shape to the book. Now, he says, with the Lincoln Highway, from the very first, I imagined it as a story told over 10 days. But he said, when I started to write the book, it was laid out in sections entitled Day 1, Day 2, Day 3, Day, and so on. And then I was about halfway through writing the first draft, and I became frustrated. He said, I didn't like the way the book felt. It felt unwieldy, the sections were cumbersome or slow, and I just didn't like it. So he says, so I went back to the beginning and I began revising. I decided that it should be told as a countdown, not as a going up like day 1. So he said, so I renamed the sections 10, 9, 8, 7, and that's what the sections of the book are. And within each, so you begin at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, till you go to 1. And within those sections, you have the different voices of the different characters. And he said that it made me realize that the reader would that way get the feeling of knowing that the story was not open-ended, that you were counting, because when you count down, you're counting down to, like when you count a spacecraft, right? Like that's the way they do it, and 1 and then blast off. So he said, this way the reader would know that there was going to be an inescapable conclusion at the end of my story. And so that's what he does. He was asked also, because the Lincoln Highway, so what happens here, that this is a road journey, right? This is really all American in the sense that America is a huge country. And now with this Lincoln Highway, which was built, I found out, it says here in 1912, you can drive from one end of the country to another. And an American, if you think of American novels, there have been a number of very well-known American stories that are road trips, because the car is also iconic to America. When you think of Europe, you wouldn't think so much of road trips. You would think maybe of train journeys. Yeah, that would probably be it. But in America, it's the car and the open road. Apart from the cities, you've got these vast stretches of prairie and of plain. And so this is going to be this book, you could say, is another addition to the American automobile odyssey as a genre in American fiction. And they're a staple of American literature. And Towles puts his own energizing step on the formula. He actually even borrows, I thought, a few elements from Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It's Kansas and it's Nebraska, and it's like there's a feel to this as well. There's all kinds of hijinks that ensue in the story when Duchess and Wooly make off with the Studebaker, bound for New York, leaving the Watson brothers stranded because Emmett has told Duchess, when Duchess shows up, Wooly is just the sidekick. When Duchess says, let's go to New York, and Emmett says, no, I'm going the other direction. And then Duchess says, okay, you don't want this, I'm going to steal your car. And off he goes, he takes the car, leaving the Watson brothers, 18-year-old and 8-year-old, stranded. So what do? They hop on a freight train. And then you have this whole, which is another American classic, the freight trains and people riding the rails, the guys who ride the rails. And so we have a whole other world of description when the two brothers are trying to get now from where they are in Nebraska to New York City, because they're looking for the car. And they hop a New York bound freight train in pursuit. And en route, Emmett and Billy encounter a cast of Technicolor characters. You have a drunken aristocrat, a grifter evangelist, this Pastor John, who tries to steal Billy's collection of silver dollars and turns out to be not a very nice man. Like his name as Pastor John is kind of ironic. And Ulysses, a Black World War II veteran who, like his Greek namesake, is nearing the lengthy journey back to his wife and son, he's hoping. And they're not in Nebraska anymore. The book shifts very cleverly, I thought. I don't know if you noticed this, if you picked it up, between first and third person narration. And did you wonder why? Because a lot of people ask that. Why did you switch? What was the point of doing it? And he answers, Mr. Towles answers, he said that because the characters presented themselves differently to him. And he felt that the characters, because who was told in first person? Duchess is in first person, and Sally, the neighbor. He said those voices just came to him because they were such strong characters that they are in first person. The others are in third person narrative. And he said that when he wrote his other books, he never used first person. He said he never used the technique of an omniscient narrator. An omniscient narrator is when the narrator knows everything. He says, rather, I prefer to use either first person. Rules of Civility was told entirely in first person through the point of view of this 25-year-old young woman, or through a third person, which he says is an extension of the protagonist's tone, vocabulary, and point of view, which is what he used in A Gentleman in Moscow. So he says, in this book, I took both of the techniques. The chapters of the 6 characters are told in a third person that reflects their point of view and their tone, while the chapters of Duchess and Sally are in the first person. So he does it, even though it's third person, you still feel close to the character. He says that, this is where he just says, Duchess and Sally, they presented themselves to me as first person narrators. So I just have to write them like that. And I trusted that because I feel they have such strong and vocal personality. And so he also said, interesting, I don't know if anybody also picked up talking about the style of the book, that he doesn't use quotation marks. Did anybody notice that? Yeah. So he was asked, why don't you use quotation marks? He uses what's called, it's a publishing term, M dashes. You know this, there's N dashes and M dashes. So an EN and EM. And I guess N dash is a short one because it's like the letter N, and an M dash is the longer dash equivalent to the letter M. So if you look at the way the book is written, he has a dash at the beginning instead of quotation marks. And he was asked, why do you do that? And he said, I did the same thing in my previous books. And you know why? And this is really interesting because I never really thought of this. But he said, when an author writes with quotation marks, they'll say, and I was going to the store, quotation marks, comma, she said as she looked across the room, and going to buy da da da. So he said, so there's like interruptions in between. So I use the technique of just a dash to clarify that this is conversation, this is dialogue here, but without any description in between, or even if there was description in between, it's still there. And it just to me, it worked really well. I didn't even realize this till I realized after, oh, there are no quotation marks, because I thought that it flowed, and when you go back and when you look at it, it really works very well. Not that he doesn't have description, because he has description as well, but he chose, so that was the reason he said he didn't use quotation marks, in case somebody was wondering about this. And so he says that, so in his characters, so you've got the very, very different voices. You have Duchess's quirky bravado that adds a kick to the story, but also reveals his very astute humanity, even though he's a con artist, son of a con artist. And he says, because and his companion is Wooly, and remember Wooly. So Wooly, there's this feeling in the story that yes, this is going to be a rollicking saga, a road trip with these two brothers and all their adventures, and they're riding the rails, and there are the 2 other characters, the ones who've gone off in Emmett's car, for which Emmett is trying to, he's trying to catch up with them and trying to get his car, and all these various things take place as they're chasing and trying to get the car. But there's also, I think, a sense of there's something very sad about Wooly, and a sense of impending doom, I think, from not the very beginning, but as we meet the characters, then who knows what is going to happen, because there is violence in the story. I mean, the boys end up in this correction center and why does Emmett, we find out what was he doing there, because it was involuntary manslaughter, because he was responsible for the death of this very not nice guy who he pushed, and the guy fell back and hit his head and ended up dying. So which is why Emmett ends up in this in the detention center. The characters are all our main characters are all these pretty decent people. I mean, Duchess, you could argue maybe not, like, but of course he has that upbringing and that father who abandoned him at an early age. And as the book progresses, we get more and more of their stories. But so the beginning, those of you, well, you read the beginning, I'm not gonna, there was one point where Billy, the 8-year-old, explains what the Lincoln Highway is, when he says to his brother, you know, you remember how Mom left us on the 5th of July? I remember. She wrote us a postcard every day for the next 9 days. And Billy shows Emmett, his older brother, the postcards. This is, as I say, the book opens with Emmett coming home. He's being driven back by the warden of the detention center. He arrives back home at his farmhouse. He's reunited with his brother. Then he finds out that the house is being foreclosed, and what's going to happen next. So Billy has a plan. Billy shows his older brother the postcards, and he says, let's go and find her. And Billy unfolds a road map, which again is like ancient history now. I'm just feeling 1950 road maps, which who uses road maps now? You use Google Maps and whatever ways on your phone. Nobody has very few people have actual maps. So this is 1954. Billy, the 8-year-old, very precocious, smart 8-year-old kid, goes into his backpack. He takes out something that looks like a pamphlet. When he unfolded it on the table, Emmett could see that it was a road map of the United States from a Phillips 66 gas station. Cutting all the way across the middle of the map was a roadway that had been scored by Billy in black ink, and that's the picture at the front of the story, at the front of the book. In the western half of the country, the names of the 9 towns along the route had been circled. 9 towns. This is the Lincoln Highway, explained Billy. He's explaining this to his older brother, pointing to the long black line. It was invented in 1912 and named for Abraham Lincoln, and was the very first road to stretch from one end of America to the other. Starting on the Atlantic seaboard, Billy began following the highway with his fingertip. It starts in Times Square in New York City, and it ends 3,390 miles away in Lincoln Park in San Francisco. And it passes right through Central City, which is just 25 miles from our house. This is when they're still there at the beginning in Nebraska. When Mom left us on the 5th of July, this is the way she went. And Billy lays out the different postcards, placing each card under the corresponding town on the map. And Billy gave an exhale of satisfaction when he sees the cards all laid out very orderly. And then Emmett says to him, but Billy, I'm not sure we're going to go to California. We have to go to California, Emmett. Don't you see? That's why she sent us the postcards, so that we could follow her. But she hasn't sent us a postcard in 8 years, because July 13th was when she stopped moving. All we have to do is take the Lincoln Highway to San Francisco, and that's where we'll find her. This, like, sweet, I mean, it's heartbreaking. 8-year-old boy, his mother has abandoned him, and this is what he's telling his older brother who's just come back from detention center. Emmett's immediate instinct was to say something to his brother that was sensible and dissuasive. Something about how their mother didn't necessarily stop in San Francisco, how she could easily have continued on, and most likely had. And that while she might have been thinking of her sons on those first 9 nights, all evidence suggested that she hadn't been thinking of them ever since. In the end, he settled for pointing out that even if she were in San Francisco, it would be virtually impossible for them to find her. And Billy answers things like, the descriptions are so wonderful. Billy says, yes, yeah, I thought of that. But, and Billy has an answer for this too, remember that you told me how Mom loved fireworks so much? She took us all the way to Seward on the 4th of July just so we could see the big display. So he says, we have to get to San Francisco by the 4th of July, and we'll go to the park every year, Lincoln Park, San Francisco's largest park. They have every year on the 4th of July, one of the biggest firework displays in all of California. So that's where our mother's going to be. So it's simple. We just have to get ourselves there, be there on the 4th of July, go to this fireworks display, and we will find our mother. And Emmett agrees to this. And that starts, even though he doesn't really believe that this is going to work out, and that starts out the adventure. And so it continues for 575 pages longer, this adventure, with all kinds of characters, with all kinds of, diversions. They don't end up going westward 1,500 miles. They go, as Emmett points out, 1,500 miles the wrong direction, only to have to try and go back 3,000 miles in the right direction, right? In the direction that he intended to at the beginning. And along the way, we get to know the characters, we get to meet all these different and really very colorful. The imagination of this author is really something. You can also see that he's his English literature background is there. There's a lot of Greek mythology, this character of Ulysses, and what precocious 8-year-old Billy he brings along with him in his backpack. He has his favorite book, which is a compendium of adventure stories written by this professor with this strange sounding name. And one of the stories there is Ulysses, and Ulysses, is a story, is a travel story. And the author of the book clearly knows all these different adventure stories. He writes with such an intelligence and such a sense of humor and such a sense of humanity that to me is one of the noteworthy aspects of his fiction. And as I said, it definitely, the characters, this first and third person narrative shifts very cleverly that you don't really even notice. You get to know the 6 main characters as well as get the other more, smaller characters. And just the way, the different little bits of the way there's so much to read, just read the book. But I was trying to figure out which little excerpts I wanted to read to you to quote. So for example, the character of Wooly, who is this boy from this 18-year-old from this very, very wealthy family, who's just something he doesn't fit in, and he's sweet and he's kind and he's just not happy. And Duchess, who's taken him under his wing, this very street smart, and it turns out illiterate young man whose father was the actor and the con artist consummate, who's abandoned Duchess as well. And there's so much abandonment in this story. I think that's one of the themes of the way different characters have been abandoned. So for example, Duchess, when he describes Wooly, he says, he was raised in one of those doorman buildings on the Upper East Side. He had a house in the country, a driver in the car, and a cook in the kitchen. His grandfather was friends with Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt. There's a tender sort of soul who, in the face of such abundance, feels a sense of looming trepidation, like the whole pile of houses and cars and Roosevelt's is going to come tumbling down on top of him. And it's a little bit of foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end of the story. So you have sadness to the ending, not only sadness, but you definitely have these plaintive and sad bits to the story, narrated with expression. Duchess has this voice with such expression. And then by contrast, you have Emmett's sections. Emmett is the boy from Nebraska, narrated in a close third person. His prose is very plain, largely because he's somewhat of I don't know, how would you call him, a cipher. He's kind of buffeted around by twisters of his own making. And yet the whole novel is tied together by the author. And to me, what comes through is that Amor Towles' America in this book it's really a period timepiece. You have to put yourself back, 1954, powder blue Studebakers, road maps of America. Gas probably cost a couple of cents a gallon. And well, 1954, probably not everybody had a car the way they did maybe more in the 60s and in the 70s. But his America in this book, anyway, brims with outcasts scrambling over scraps from the Emerald City, con artists behind the curtain, and the innocence that they exploit. The book is full of the author reveling in boxcars and flop houses and seedy bars, which you could kind of say are like the junkyard of failed dreams. And as Duchess, again, this character of Duchess opines in his first person voice, when it comes to waiting, has-beens have plenty of practice, like for the bars to open, for the welfare check to arrive. And they, before too long, eventually something will happen. And in the book at the end, eventually to Duchess, I don't have to necessarily give this away, but something happens as well. And the story ends with the boys, well, anyways, we're going to go into the details at the end of the story, but the road trip ends where Duchess had wanted it to, which is in the Adirondack, this magnificent camp that the Wolcott family has in the Adirondacks, just before we hope that Emmett and brother Billy are going to be able to set back the opposite direction on the Lincoln Highway. And this is what at the very end of the book, Billy says to his brother, I think if we're going to do this, when they get the car back, if we're going to do it, we should go down to Times Square, because we have to begin our cross-country trip the other way properly there. And if we start right away, we can make it by the 4th of July. And hopefully, this is 8-year-old kid who is just really all he wants to do is to find his mother. And he says that what he wanted to do in the book too, you could call it, what's the fancy word, Bildungsroman, which is a coming of age story, which is really what it is as well. And he says here, when he's asked, the transition from childhood to youth to adulthood in your main characters is compressed in this book into a matter of 10 days, because that's the actual action of the story. I mean, you get a lot more background, of course, 575 pages. It's not just the 10 days, but the book is 10 days. So when he was asked to comment on that, he makes, which I thought was a very interesting point. He says, when children are young, the nuclear family is a very tight unit, even when it's dysfunctional. The relationships between husband and wife, parents and children, among siblings, they are very much there. They're the focus. They govern the habits and the behaviors. They influence perspectives and emotion. And you can remember back to your own childhood, when you're young, your household is what you know. And it's only when you get a little older that you go over to a friend's house, however old you are, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you realize that things are done differently. But he says, but when children come of age in their late teens and early 20s, the household begins to naturally unwind. As young adults go off to college, enter careers, get married, their focus shifts away from the household in which they were raised towards a world that they must shape for themselves. So he says, I wanted my book to show, he says, this is about this transition in a concentrated fashion. Emmett, Duchess, Wooly, and Sally is the neighbor from Nebraska. She's this feisty young woman, a kind of woman's liver ahead of her time, who's been up till now, and she's also a young woman, 18, 19 years old. She has to take care of the house in the farm, because she lives on the farm next door to where Emmett and Billy live, and taking care of her father. And she's very resentful of the fact that her days are spent cooking and cleaning and washing, and her father just seems to be totally ungrateful for it. And when she gets her first opportunity, she hops into her pickup truck and drives off to New York City to find Emmett and Billy as well. And she has that. And so that's why the author said she has a first person voice, because he felt that she had to be a very strong character. So he says, the author, that this book, The Lincoln Highway, is about this transition from childhood, youth, to young adulthood. And my main characters are all in the process of moving on from the family structure in which they were raised to some unknown world of their own fashioning, with all the challenges and opportunities, all the insights and illusions that the transition implies. And just one more comment just one thing I wanted to say, and then if we'd like to have some discussion, is why did he set it in 1954? Why did he pick this particular time? So he said that 1954, America was at peace. The Korean War had just ended, and the Vietnam War had not yet begun, and America's involvement was not yet, not going to be, they weren't going to be so involved for a few more years. And the economy was booming. And he said, although America, there was the beginning, America didn't ramp up its full military presence in Vietnam until 1965. In November 1955, President Eisenhower deployed the Military Assistance Advisory Group, which were American military personnel sent to train the South Vietnamese armed forces. So that was the first, that was just going to be happening a year later. But 1954, America was at peace. The battle for civil rights in America, and the character of Ulysses, who was that Black man who was searching for his wife and his child, the battle for civil rights in America is as old as the Union itself. But in 1954, the modern civil rights movement was about to begin. On May 17th, which was just a month before the time setting of this book, the Supreme Court handed down its landmark decision on Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, initiating the end of legal segregation and the concept of separate but evil, at least on paper. And in the decade that followed would come Rosa Parks' refusal. Remember that she wouldn't get up to give her seat on the bus, and the resulting Montgomery bus boycott led by Martin Luther King, 1955, the lunch counter protest, 1960, the Freedom Riders, 1961, the March on Washington, 1963, and all these. So it was the beginning of the civil rights era. Also, what became known as the sexual revolution was about to begin. Apparently, I didn't know this fact. In December of 1953, Hugh Hefner published his first issue of Playboy magazine with Marilyn Monroe as his centerfold, launching, as Amor Towles said when he answered this question, a new era of publicly acceptable pornography. That same year, the Kinsey Report was released, and then it would take off eventually 1961 when the pill was approved. So this setting of 1954, he chose it very, very, for a definite reason. He also said television and rock and roll, two of the greatest cultural influences of the 20th century, were also about to take off in America. In 1950, there were only 1 million households in the US with a television set. By 1954, 30 million was the number of households. And by 1959, 88% of US households would have at least one television set. And in those first 10 years of television, many of the lasting formats and idioms of the television, of that medium, were defined from the evening news broadcast to the sitcom, from the soap opera to the late night talk show. So he said, and also rock and roll. And Amor Towles is a big rock and roll fan. He said 1954, the two big hits, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and Rock Around the Clock by Billy Haley and the Comets. 1954 was for those, were released that year. So this is really an iconic, year in America. And this is what the book celebrates. And he says, finally, in 1954, the road culture of modern America was about to begin. So that's why he created this road story. In 1954, America had, these are his statistics, which just add to the, to the interest that's interesting in the book, that America had only 6% of the world's population and 60% of its cars. So, you may say car, but the automobile was primarily used as a local convenience because distances were great. But when the Lincoln Highway was conceived of by Carl Fisher in 1912, at that time, 90% of America's roads back in 1912 were not paved. In the 1920s, the federal government, the American federal government, invested a lot in highways, and they established the first numbered routes. You know, roads had numbers, but long distance roads were fairly rudimentary for decades. It wasn't until June 1956 that the Federal Aid Highway Act passed and the interstate highway system began being built. So multi-lane, high-speed highways crossing the nation, you know, transportation of goods and workers and vacationers and all that. And that was taking off. So, but he said, back in 1954, so it was still, you know, relatively new at the time, Holiday Inn only had 3 locations, but it would have 500 10 years later and 1,000 by 1968. 1954 was the year that both McDonald's and Burger King were launched. There also seems to be, you remember Howard Johnson? He mentions it, Howard Johnson, because Woolley loved Howard Johnson. So poor Woolley. Woolley, who stayed in the fanciest hotels, whose parents schlepped him, his mother schlepped him around the world to see the Parthenon and this, and he has this, Woolley has this one passage where he says, he described, this is Woolley's voice, and he said, okay, one last thing I'll read you. In a chapter that Woolley this is Woolley's chapter, he writes, "It was on a trip to Greece with his mother in 1946, while standing at the foot of the Parthenon, that Woolley first gained an inkling of the list with a capital L. At that itemization of all the places that one was supposed to see. There it is," she had said, this is Woolley's mother, while fanning herself with her map, when they had reached the dusty summit overlooking Athens. "The Parthenon in all its glory." In addition to the Parthenon, as Woolley was soon to learn, there were the Piazza San Marco in Venice, the Louvre in Paris, and the Uffizi in Florence. There were the Sistine Chapel and Notre Dame and Westminster Abbey. It was something of a mystery to Woolley where the list came from. It seemed to have been compiled by various scholars and eminent historians long before he was born. No one had ever quite explained to Woolley why one needed to see all those places on the list, but there was no mistaking the importance of doing so. For his elders would inevitably praise him if he had seen one, frown at him if he expressed disinterest in one, and chastise him in no uncertain terms if he happened to be in the vicinity of one and failed to pay it a visit. And so, you know, this is just Woolley's describing, he just doesn't get it. And he comes from this. And so anyway, so this is what Woolley has grown up. These are the places that he wants to see, but he likes Howard Johnson restaurants. Orange and blue, right? That's the color combination, as he points out in the book. That's the color scheme of Howard Johnson's restaurant. So while great cultural shifts that defined America from 1955 to 1970 were not yet dominating the headlines in 1954, they were just simmering beneath the surface, and that's why the author chose to set the book at this particular period in time. I thought this is a long and winding road, this novel, but it's a road that the author's motley crew navigates with brains, with heart, great heart, and with courage. It's a novel of the contradictions of the human character that the author, with a very skillful hand, at least in my opinion, guides the reader forward with a kind of floating sensation, like one who's being carried down a wide river on a warm summer day. And it's not, you know, June, so the book does take place on warm summer days. And by the end, I say the ending has, you know, its bittersweet components to it. But this is, in my mind, Amor Towles, his third novel. And so different from his others. You know, he had Rules of Civility in New York, and you had Gentleman in Moscow, 30 Years in That Life, in the first one 1 year, and here 10 Days, an American Road Saga. When he was asked in the last question of an interview, what are you working on next? He gave the cryptic answer, something different. So we'll see what it is going to be. I don't know, but he's an author who's able to work his magic in all kinds of ways. Any questions, comments? Anybody wanted to? Those of you who read the book, what did you?
I have an idea about why Woolley would have been first person, because Or maybe it was the only way to make him a sympathetic character because he was such a kind artist.
Oh, Duchess, okay, Duchess, right, yeah.
And that maybe we had to hear his own voice.
Yeah.
So that we could empathize or at least recognize, see who he is, like when he went to Harlem to get punched in the back. By,
Yeah,
you know, like
yeah.
we needed to understand that he had values.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I just like that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that it's true, because if you would have, when Duchess did this and Duchess did that, even though his third person is very close third person,
Yeah.
it's not the same as hearing from himself. And like you said, like, why would he go? What kind of logic is this that he goes and he presents himself to Townhouse, another former inmate of this correctional facility, and says, punch me, hit me, I deserve it. I deserve to get punched because I was the one, because of what I did, that you ended up getting the beating that you did, that you had to suffer that beating. So now give me back what I deserve. And it's like, and these guys are like, are you out of your mind? And no, really, stand here. And he let himself get hit. And it's true from Duchess's point of view. So there's this idea of justice and his idea of what's justice and what's morally right. And given his father, who abandoned him and did the abs, because really of all the abandonment, like Emmett and Billy's mother abandons them when Billy is just an infant. Then it turns out Duchess's father throws him into sets him up so that can you imagine this, sets him up so that his son is incarcerated for stealing something because he wants to get rid of his boy. It's
And Duchess's values are very, very strong because one, he wanted to go to New York because of Townsend. He wanted to even
to make himself pay for what he felt he had to,
that he got even with Duchess. But he wanted Woolley to get his inheritance.
Yeah.
And he had no intention of taking the money from him. He wanted Woolley to have the money.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is that, if you recall, Emmett had stored some money in the trunk of the car.
Yeah.
That they talked
And
about.
his father had bequeathed and left him.
And
Yeah.
Not much. But
No.
it was going to be enough for
I mean,
him.
relatively, right back in $3,000, it wasn't like nothing, but it wasn't 150 that,
It was going to be enough for him to
Yeah.
do a flip. To start his
right, to start his business. Yeah.
And Duchess was using some of that money, but
He kept this
taking-
strict
he kept
accounting.
the
Yeah,
accounting
yeah,
and the
yeah,
intention was
yeah,
to return the
yeah,
money.
yeah.
So there was good progress.
Yes, yeah.
You know, he ended up, like you said in the reportory, because his father set him up.
Yeah.
He of all of them, he didn't do anything illegal.
No, he didn't. He didn't do anything, not even slightly. And then what do you think of that ending? The ending where, like, and he was asked, the author was asked, what do you think, how will Emmett feel if he finds out what happened? And the author answers, this is like, it's always going to be an interesting question and answer with authors. He says that I don't think that Emmett is likely ever to find out what happened to Duchess, because he says no one had any reason to suspect that Billy and Emmett were in the Adirondacks in the first place, and Duchess's end will be viewed as an accident. So the author is not worried that Emmett will ever find out and have to live with the guilt of what happened there.
He didn't know that Emmett was right.
No, and that wasn't his intention. His intention was the way the whole thing was set up at the end with the rocks and the boat, and then
He
like-
made him from getting.
Yeah.
From falling.
And if the wind wouldn't have blown and the notes wouldn't have started to flutter away and he wouldn't have leaned over and so anyways.
And then you can imagine how Billy and Emmett fare out west with the benefits.
And you
that they
wonder,
afford.
right? But you wonder, the whole thing is so open-ended. You
With
don't
Sally
know
and-
what's gonna happen. Will they find their mother? Is this a dream of this 8-year-old kid that they're gonna find their mother? You don't know.
They have
I
no
don't know.
money
It's
to
all
afford
very,
it.
very open-ended, like
I think it's a successful business.
maybe, yeah, whether they find their mother or not. Yeah. And that the wonderful character, the author of the book that Billy is reading, that they go up to they go up to that building and they find him, and this Professor Abacus Abernathy is sitting there, and it turns out his name was Sam somebody, and he recreated this stuff, and he's been living his life there. I mean, it was just, I don't know, the moments and the descriptions. And again, this one, Woolley is describing, and Woolley's looking around. Woolley, that's why I said he had this list. You have to go see the Parthenon and the Sistine Chapel and the Uffizi and all these places in Europe where his family, you had to go. But what about, he never saw the Brooklyn Bridge, and he never saw, places in New York, because he grew up on the Upper East Side. And where did he go? I mean, in America, up to the Adirondacks, and you didn't need to cross ever the Brooklyn Bridge, or you didn't need to go on any of those roads. And when he sees the elevated, remember that scene where the abandoned railway, and they're up there and all this overgrowth, and Woolley says, oh, and one thing that had bothered him about New York was its permanence. And here he sees that, when something like there's not such permanence, this whole railroad is abandoned and overgrown with weeds. And he's thrilled by all of this. Like, he's like, and the Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty in the distance. He's never seen his own city, because that wasn't on the list of what the Woolcott family did. Any other? Yeah.
Another thing about Towles' writing is that I read a gentleman in Moscow a number of years ago.
Yeah.
I think it's pronounced Simon. I don't, somebody reviewed it there, I'm not sure, it wasn't prepared. But anyway, and the Lincoln Highway recently, but I still have visuals from
I
hotel
just-
in Moscow, many Clark and from this. And so I think that he's so amazing in creating images that remain in your mind.
Yeah, he's that coupled with his understanding of human nature, the psyche of his character.
All genders and ages.
All genders and ages.
Couldn't be more against too. The book that we didn't read, not the Moscow one, but the
Rules of Civility.
Yeah, did you feel that he got, you said that it was written from the point of view
Of a 25-year-old woman. I thought that was an interesting that he got the voice there of that character. Yeah, that was based on, and he started that story because he saw a series of, which you probably have seen, of photographs taken during the Depression of people sitting on the subway. Walker Evans, a well-known photographer, carried a camera. I mean, this is real. He carried a camera in his coat jacket, and he took pictures of people sitting in the New York City subway system. And there was an exhibit of them, and that's what he based Rules of Civility on, and created this also a very particular time period, a year in the life of this 25-year-old young woman. I thought he did it cleverly as well. It was a much shorter book than the other two, but yeah, worth reading, especially because the characters, like, there are bits pieces of this in there as well. So
It would be interesting to see what he writes about these last years. Now,
you mean,
no, what I mean is he writes a book about what's been happening in the States in these last.
oh, I wonder, well, when he was asked, what are you writing about now? And he said something different. So who knows?
Maybe,
Really,
maybe.
who knows?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
He's an author of, well, and then in 2 out of the 3 books, very much a New Yorker, like by now, it's so much of New York is part of his book, of those 2 books. So Moscow was different, but, yeah, interesting. I thought that was interesting too, that he got the idea for the gentleman in Moscow when he stayed in a hotel in Geneva and thought, oh, what would it be like to be stuck in a hotel so he created the character of that aristocrat who was imprisoned in Hotel Metropole for 30 years of his life. Yeah. Okay, so, yes.
Did you find that most of the people in the book were men? There were no women involved. And it's an adventure of men living in 1954. And if we go back to today, many of those people survived and can remember back to those incidents that happened. Because I found it was a book about men living like men.
Well, they were young boy. I mean, it was, most of the characters were, although you had Sally. I mean, she was the one feisty young woman who left the farm in Nebraska and it seemed like was interested in heading off to California, but the main part of the characters were.
Because you can recall the first McDonald's in Montreal was in 1967. And this was 1954. So you can imagine how far behind we were with the American.
Oh, fine American culinary experience, yeah.
Culinary experience. That's a generous.
That woman for Korean, who was very much.
Right, sorry, Willie's sister, Sarah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that was to portray her quite differently.
Quite differently, but also very sympathetically.
And
And her husband, oh, and did anybody catch that? Dennis, the only place quotation marks were used was with the character of Dennis. Dennis is Sarah, Willie's brother-in-law. And he's always, his name is written Dennis in quotation marks. So he was asked, somebody said in one of the questions, I was just reading online questions, why his name had a quotation mark? So he said, I just imagine him as such a self-absorbed, pompous, obnoxious character. I mean, he didn't say that when I'm rephrasing it. That I can imagine that when Willie was first introduced, and Sarah's this kind, sweet, she's the one who takes care of her brother. Like she tried to take care of him. And Dennis is probably socially acceptable, and that's why she marries him, because they're so very different. That when Dennis introduces himself to Willie, younger brother Willie, that he's so that Towles wrote him always as Dennis in quotation marks because he's like so full of himself. So that was why, in case you were wondering, why Dennis is always in quotation marks. You're welcome. Pardon? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It was so much fun. It was so much fun to be here.